Alright, hello everybody. We're going to talk about spontaneous generation today. So you made a booklet in class. We're going to look at the front cover of that booklet right now. So spontaneous, let's break down that term. So spontaneous generation, spontaneous means to happen kind of out of the blue. And generation in this case means creation. So you're the next generation in this society. You're the next creation. So spontaneous generation is creating something out of the blue. Spontaneous, something happens, random. And so spontaneous generation was this theory. Now we're talking way back in the 1600s and before. It was the thought that living things could come from something non-living. So for example, on your booklet you have a worm and a fly. People used to believe that worms were created from mud. Yes, that's right, you heard me. Mud would create worms. Some people used to think that raindrops would create worms. Well, if you think about it, when it rains really hard, what comes out? Worms. So they had no idea that this microscopic life, these tiny organisms, could create life. And so they never seen a worm give birth. Now we know today that worms lay eggs, and those eggs hatch into baby worms under the ground. Again, none of this has been seen. We can see that humans give birth to humans, dogs give birth to dogs, cats give birth to cats. But we've never seen a worm give birth. So people weren't dumb. They just didn't realize that small life could create life. They thought it had to be something else. The same thing with the flies. Baby flies are called maggots. Maggots look like pieces of rice that move. So if you ever see a piece of rice that moves, don't eat it. It's a maggot. Okay? Maggots like to live on dead things. So flies lay their eggs on food source. The eggs hatch and turn into a larva we call maggots, and those maggots then feed off of that food source. Now, fast forward a little bit, and there's this doctor. You ready for his picture? Bam! There it is. A little creepy. But his name is Francesco Redi. He was around the mid-1600s, and he was an Italian doctor who said, you know what, I just don't understand the spontaneous generation. I believe life creates life. There's no exceptions to that rule. So he wanted to challenge the theory of spontaneous generation. He came up with, his question was, where do maggots come from? He had this belief that maggots could not come from meat, that they actually came from flies. So he set up his experiment, and he took 3 jars. The first jar he had was open, put meat in it. The second jar was sealed with kind of a netting or a gauze and had meat in it. And the third jar was sealed completely with a paper covering and had meat in it. In his first jar, what do you think happened? It was open. That's right. The maggots actually were seen on the meat. So the flies were flying around it, maggots appeared. Now, Redi knew this would happen. In his experiment, that's called the control group. So the open container was Redi's control group. He then took a second container because all of his critics were saying, Redi, you proved us right. Spontaneous generation is true. Maggots do come from meat. You just proved that to us. Redi said, that was my control group. Here's another jar. So he took this jar and it has gauze over it. Now, what do you think happened to the jar with this netting or gauze on it? That's right. The maggots appeared on the netting, which proved to us that flies have what sense? It's one of the 5 senses. Yes, they can smell the meat. So the flies were able to smell the meat, and they laid their eggs on the netting. The netting hatched, or the eggs hatched into maggots. Okay? His critics said, Redi, I still believe in spontaneous generation. I don't believe that flies created the maggots. So Redi created his third jar, which was sealed completely, and not a single maggot developed. Okay, the flies could not smell the meat, and not a single maggot developed. So he disproved spontaneous generation and ultimately proved the life cycle of the fly. Now, there were still critics out there who said, I still believe microscopic life can come from something non-living. So along comes this British fellow named Needham, and Needham was a wig-wearing Brit who ultimately challenged Redi's theory. He believed that life could come from something non-living. So what he did, now please listen carefully because he made a mistake in his experiment. He took a container of broth, he poured it into another glass container, he boiled that broth, let it cool, and then poured it back into his original container. Sure enough, microbes grew in the broth. What did he do incorrectly? That's right. He used a contaminated container. His original container wasn't sterilized. So, this dude, Spallanzani, little creepy picture, but Spallanzani said, Needham, I know you did your experiment wrong. You used a contaminated container. You didn't sterilize it. So I'm going to sterilize my container and the broth. I'm going to boil it and boil it and boil it. And that's what he did. Spallanzani boiled both the broth and the container. Sure enough, not a single microbe appeared in the broth. But his critics said, Spallanzani, you boiled the life force out of the broth. Spallanzani was so confused by this. The life force sounds like something out of Star Wars, right? Well, people used to believe that there was this magical force that would create life. And because Spallanzani boiled his broth and his container so much, he destroyed the life force in it. He was stumped. He couldn't figure out a way to allow air to move into the container without the microbes moving in as well. So fast forward 100 years, and this really important dude came along. His name was Louis Pasteur. What he did was, check out your pictures there. He created these flasks that were like this S shape. They have this really long neck. And the microbes ultimately get stuck in those flasks. I'm trying to find a picture here for you. There it is. So where it says dust, that would be the microbes. The microbes get stuck in those tubes, and they can't get up, but the air can. So he disproved this idea that there is a life force that creates matter, that it's actually the microbes. And he was so profound and so important, we use his name to this day. Do you know what we use it for? Think about when you drink milk or juice. That's right. It's pasteurized or pasteurization. We use his name today, spelled exactly the same, for pasteurizing our liquids to make them sterile so that the microbes don't grow in it. Now, Pasteur took his one container, he tipped it over so that the broth would flow into those tubes, and then tipped it back upright so that the broth flows back into the bottom of the jar here. What do you think happened to this? That's right. When he tipped it over, the microbes came in contact with the broth, and when he tipped it back, the microbes were in the broth, proving that the microbes are found here, and that's ultimately what caused broth to spoil. Well, I hope you understood this, and you are now going to answer the questions on the other slip of paper. Good luck.